Got the clicker here. Well, hello. Good to be here with all of you tonight. This is amazing. I think this turnout is incredible. And I've been following online what you all have been up to over the last couple of years. And I can tell you, and what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, is you're moving at lightning speed compared to the way things unfolded in Pittsburgh over the past 35 years or so. I got here to southwestern Pennsylvania in 1982. That was to work for KDKA-TV. That was the year before Pittsburgh and probably Johnstown hit rock bottom. I think in 1983, the metro unemployment rate around Pittsburgh, so the Pittsburgh metro was over 18% that year. And in Beaver County, out near the airport, the unemployment rate in 1983 was 29%. And the following year, 50,000 people moved out. Net loss of 50,000 people. We lost 50,000 more people than we gained. So those were dark, challenging times. And working for the television station, I got thrust into covering all those stories. And in fact, I was here in Johnstown off and on for a number of years because we shared so much of that same story and that same experience when our industrial economy was just pulled right out from under us in the space of really what was just a few years. And so I got to tell that story, but I also got to be a witness over what's now been 35 years of what it took and what it's taken to bring Pittsburgh back. And hopefully there's some lessons I can share with you tonight that'll give you some confidence that you can engineer the same sort of miracles here in Johnstown and in Cambria County if you do what you're doing right now, which is really working together, finding ways to build bridges, literally and figuratively, and really follow this vision that you're developing. And it's amazing how fast you can move once you get yourselves organized. And you all are doing that right now, and I think you'll amaze yourselves with what you can accomplish once you're able to develop that shared vision. But what I'm going to share with you tonight is a little bit of history and a little bit of today, and a few lessons learned about Pittsburgh's great American comeback. And we are basking in the glow of great PR over in Pittsburgh these days. We've been turning up on lists around the world. Foreign Direct Investment magazine calls Pittsburgh a top American city of the future. Trulia and LinkedIn, #1 metro for college graduates in the United States. Money Magazine among the best big cities in the U.S. And this is just a few of them. I've got a whole list of them back at the office of all the accolades that Pittsburgh's been racking up just in the last couple of years. And beginning 2016, so almost 2 years ago now, I went out for the ribbon cutting at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. And one of the things they did back in Pittsburgh back in the 80s was decide they were going to have the most powerful supercomputer outside a government lab anywhere in the United States. And so CMU and Pitt operate something called the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, which tackles the really tough problems. And they cut the ribbon on their new machine. It was called Bridges back in the spring of 16. And there was a fellow there from Hewlett-Packard named Bill Manuel. And he said in HP's estimation, Pittsburgh really is as well positioned as any place in the world to be at the center of what he called the idea economy, with leading strengths in computing, big data, and artificial intelligence. And his point was those three things are going to merge together. They are going to reinvent the economy. They're going to reinvent the world. They're going to change the world for all of us. And it's better to be at the front lines and at the beginning of it all than to have it come from someplace else and wash all over you. And when he said that, I thought, well, that's a great observation, and it's probably true, and it's a great glimpse of the future. But the reality is, ideas have been what Pittsburgh has been about really from the very beginning of its industrial economy a couple of centuries ago, around the same time that Johnstown's industrial economy got going. So I'm going to share a little bit of ancient history. I'm not going to go all the way back to 1860, when the Cambria Works here in Johnstown actually had greater output than any steel mill in Pittsburgh. This was the steel-making center of America in 1860. But all we need to say about that period from the Civil War until the turn of the last century probably is that this part of the world, our part of Pennsylvania, could outperform and outproduce and make more steel than pretty much anybody anywhere. So we were sharing that history and that industrial growth and all the success that both Johnstown and Pittsburgh shared for all those many years, for those decades. And in fact, it was those ideas that powered all of our industries. By 1900, Pittsburgh had sort of emerged and kind of gotten ahead Pittsburgh by itself was home to more wealth than New York and Chicago. Can you imagine? That was little old Pittsburgh actually had a greater concentration of wealth. 1901, U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in world history. And in 1940s, and this is really something we share, Western Pennsylvania, Southwestern Pennsylvania, Johnstown, just our part of Pennsylvania, produced more steel than Germany and Japan combined during the Second World War. And that was just us. That's not including Philadelphia and Gary, Indiana, and Cleveland and Birmingham, Alabama, and all those other steelmaking centers in the United States. Just our part of Pennsylvania managed to outproduce Germany and Japan. It's really an incredible history. And when you think about it, a real testament to the industrial power of the United States as recently as 75 years ago. But in Pittsburgh especially, and I'm sure the case here in Johnstown was similar, really had paid a price for that incredible success, all that wealth creation, all that industrial activity. We've heard it described, it was described by a British writer as hell with the lid taken off. He stood on a hill and looked down on the Allegheny Valley, and that's what he observed. That shot down there below, that is noon in 1936 in downtown Pittsburgh. It was the winter time and it was a rainy day, so it wasn't Pittsburgh at its best, even for those days, but it was pretty miserable. Businessmen brought an extra white shirt to work every day. They changed their shirt at lunchtime because their collars would have turned gray. And as we all know, it is much better to look good than to feel good. They were breathing all that stuff, but man, they looked well by afternoon because they had that extra shirt. And really what began to happen in Pittsburgh was a great concern about the future. And this was a mighty industrial place in those days, so plenty of economic activity, but a real concern that if they didn't do something about the environment, Pittsburgh was never going to be able to compete once the war was over. And this is really the beginning of the journey that Pittsburgh has been on for 75 years now. It was this idea that we have to come together to a community to create a better place that's going to become the place where people will want to be and where businesses will want to invest and where jobs will be created. And so in 1943, they formed a committee for post-war planning in the city. And it was largely suggested by the president of Carnegie Tech at the time. It was really the universities that said, we're not going to be able to get anybody to come here to school or to teach if we don't clean this place up. So the president of Carnegie Tech got to the big banker in town, a guy named R.K. Mellon, and he said, we ought to organize the private sector and the business community, and we'll put together a plan. Let's come up with a vision of what Pittsburgh could be like if we cleaned it up after the war. And so they did that. They put together a committee for post-war planning. That's a picture of Pittsburgh in 1940 over there on the right. And they basically decided there were 4 big things that had to happen. They weren't concerned about the economy. They had one of the busiest, most wealth-creating economies on the planet during the Second World War. So it was never a question about jobs or the economy. It was really a question about quality of life. How are we going to clean this place up? How are we going to make sure we can compete after the war? So those folks who came together in the 1940s decided there's 4 big things that we're going to work on. We're going to work on air quality, get the smoke out of the sky. We're going to work on water quality. We're going to get the raw sewage, and we're going to get the industrial pollution out of the rivers. We're going to stop the flooding. Now, Pittsburgh never had Johnstown's experiences with flooding, but it still flooded all the time, and every spring it would flood, and it would put all that sewage water all over every low-lying area around the point in downtown Pittsburgh. So they wanted to deal with the flooding. And then finally, urban redevelopment. They wanted to get rid of older areas and redevelop them and really turn Pittsburgh into a modern city. And of course, we know that today as Renaissance 1, but it really was people coming together, the leadership of that community of the city in Allegheny County saying, we can do better than this. We don't have to settle for this. They started talking about building a park and a fountain at the point in 1944. That's the first time they wrote about it. They turned on the fountain in 1974. Took 30 years to build a lousy park and a fountain. And everybody says, how did it take 30 years to knock down some buildings, build a park, and put in a fountain? Well, the reality was it wasn't the doing of the things. It wasn't the doing of cleaning the air. It wasn't the doing of cleaning the water. It wasn't the doing of urban redevelopment. They had to invent the way that all of those things would be done. Nobody in the United States had ever regulated air quality before. So how do you do it? How do you do it when you're a county? And how do you do it so you don't destroy your economy along the way? They had to think through all of that, and then they had to agree how they would do it. Nobody in the United States had ever developed a process for the government to get control of private property and then arrange private financing for public projects. So they invented the first urban redevelopment authority in the United States, the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Pittsburgh, as a vehicle, as a tool to be able to move forward and tackle that urban redevelopment challenge. And in fact, they invented the organization that I work for, the Allegheny Conference on Community Development, was really one of the tools. It was a way to bring together the business community so that they could work in partnership with Mayor David Lawrence, who was the mayor of Pittsburgh at the time, and that he would have a partner, a sort of a one-stop, one phone call to deal with the whole business community, and they would be able to really move this plan forward and ultimately achieve the goals that they did over the course of the next 30 years. And so it took them from the 1940s to the 1970s to engineer what we today know as Renaissance 1. David McCullough, who's a native son of Pittsburgh and the famous historian, looked back at that era, and what he said about Pittsburgh is just as important to all of you here tonight. When he thinks about Renaissance 1, he said the most important thing to understand and the most important lesson you can take away from Pittsburgh and from that first transformation was it didn't just happen. People made it happen. They decided we can do better than this. We're going to come together, we're going to figure it out, and we're going to stick with it for 30 years if that's what it takes. And some of us won't see how this turns out, but that doesn't matter because we're committed as a community and we're committed as leaders that we're going to start that journey and ultimately other folks will see it through. And that's really the big part of the Pittsburgh story. And we always hear the environmental story, but there's another part of the story that happened in parallel that often people don't pay as much of attention to, but I think it's every bit as important because it really explains the Pittsburgh of today. It explains what's happening in that community, and its seeds were also planted in the 1940s, around the same time that they were taking on the environment. And they began to think beyond steel. So that's a shot of downtown Pittsburgh again. In 1940, you can see the smoke, right? You can see Esmond Valley. Those are the beginning of the steel mills that would go up the Mon. You can see over here the Allegheny Valley. You can see the smoke there. You can see the pollution in the river, right? And if you look through the haze, out here you can see Oakland, which is where the universities were. And we found some writing by one of our board members back in the 1940s. And literally, this is one of the big business leaders of Pittsburgh. And he was writing, someday we may not have a steel industry. Now, can you even imagine in the 1940s a business leader when the mills are running flat out saying someday we may not have a steel industry in Pittsburgh? And he said, not only that, we have to start investing in people, in our universities, in our colleges. And we need to start investing in them so that they will invent the economy that ultimately will replace the steel industry. I mean, I don't know what was in the water. We know it was in the water in Pittsburgh those days, but how it affected some of the decisions and some of the strategic vision there, I'm still amazed by, given how powerful Pittsburgh was economically. So they looked a few miles to the east, a few miles toward Johnstown actually, to Oakland where the universities were, and they really thought about the potential of the universities, Carnegie Tech and the University of Pittsburgh, to ultimately lead the way in reinventing Pittsburgh. So that's a postcard from 1940 out in Oakland, if any of you have ever been there to see Pitt or CMU, that's what it looked like back then. And they decided we're going to invest in facilities. So we're going to build research centers, we're going to build labs, and then we're going to look all across the United States and we're going to find talented people and we're going to give them the resources they need and the facilities that they need so that they will come to Pittsburgh and they will invent these technologies and they'll begin to invent a new economy. So one of the young doctors they managed to attract was a young fellow named Jonas Salk in the 1950s, who came to Pittsburgh and built the team that ultimately cured polio. Another young doc they managed to get to Pittsburgh around 1950 was a fellow named Dr. Benjamin Spock. Any baby boomers in the room? Pretty much all of our moms had Dr. Spock's book on their nightstands because it was the guide to raising babies during the baby boom. And he did most of his early work in Pittsburgh in the early 1950s. Those two guys didn't just decide one day, oh my God, I think I'll go to Pittsburgh and see if I can get a job there. They were recruited as a strategy to begin to build this new economy that Pittsburgh might need someday. That happened in the 50s, and in the 60s, The Mellon family and the Mellon interests merged the Mellon Institute, which was an applied research institute in Pittsburgh, with Carnegie Tech to create Carnegie Mellon University. That was actually 50 years ago last year. And again, the whole idea was, let's start building these two institutions into major research universities, and they will invent something completely new. And then, doggone it if they weren't right. The bottom did ultimately fall out of the economy. And the steel industry did largely go away. I already mentioned some of the statistics, right? In roughly a 3-year period in the 1980s, Pittsburgh lost well over 100,000, close to 200,000 manufacturing jobs. And we lost about 250,000 people from southwestern Pennsylvania during the course of the 1980s. This was the most severe setback, and you all shared it here, for better or worse. It's the most severe economic setback suffered by any region in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. Nobody experienced what southwestern Pennsylvania experienced except for us. And it was the worst setback suffered by any region in the United States until Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in the 21st century. So nobody has experienced what we have gone through. And that's a really important thing to remember as you think about how we're going to come back and how we're going to rebuild these communities and position them to compete in the future. So what did they do in Pittsburgh? And now our story goes back about 35 years. Well, we built around a strong foundation. So Pittsburgh, we've always been good, as you have here in Johnstown, we've always been good at making things. We've always been good at making energy to make things. And in Pittsburgh, they've always been especially good at financing the making of things and the making of energy. We still do all of those things. Those industries are all way different than they were 35 years ago. They may not employ as many people. It's a completely different mix, but they're still there. And man, if you can make things and you can make energy and you can finance the making of energy and the making of things, you can create a lot of wealth. And if you can create that wealth, you can then invest it in other things where you can create a lot of jobs and opportunity. So in Pittsburgh, they invested in healthcare and life sciences and in IT through those universities to begin to create new companies and new technologies to retool those existing industries, so that today there literally are hundreds of companies that exist in Pittsburgh that employ tens of thousands of people that did not even exist in the 1980s. And that was the strategy. That was the economic strategy. Don't give up on what you're good at, but find the opportunities to build on your strengths and the assets to become what you can be next and how you can build on those strengths. Pittsburgh had the great fortune to, of course, have the two great research universities that they'd then been working on for 35 years to build them up, to get them in a position to really be able to create companies, create technologies, begin to commercialize things, and move them to market. And indeed, that's how that was engineered. There's a whole host of nonprofits that really work on getting innovators, incubators, accelerators. I saw some evidence that some of you are thinking about that in some of your teams. How do you provide support to entrepreneurs and innovators? How do you find financing so that they can begin to build their businesses? If you can do that locally, those companies will probably want to stay here and they'll probably want to grow here. If you can grow your own, it's often a lot more cost effective than trying to get businesses to move into a place like this from other places. And we continued to invest in quality of life. So whether it was arts and culture in downtown Pittsburgh, whether it was outdoor recreation, the completion of the Great Allegheny Passage Trail into town, brownfield remediation, and even green building, LEED certified buildings. And I've noticed there's a lot of efforts around the room here around quality of place, and it's so important. What the millennials tell us is they care as much, if not more, about the quality of the place as they do about the job and the job opportunity. And if you can deliver a quality place with great connections between places to live and places to play and places to work, you're going to have an edge over other communities that aren't thinking that through and really beginning to build that kind of a future for their communities. So that's the what we did. How did they do it? Actually, they followed a process pretty much and pretty similar to the one that you've all begun here in Johnstown. Way back in the 1980s, the Allegheny Conference commissioned the president of Carnegie Mellon, Robert Moravian, to put a team together to benchmark Pittsburgh against other places to see how they were doing. And then Dr. Moravian came back with a scathing indictment called we call it the White Paper. It had a fancier title. But it basically said that Pittsburgh was going to hell in a handbasket. They had 200 different economic development organizations. None of them were cooperating. They were all doing their own thing. Nobody was trying to coordinate anything. When I came to Pittsburgh, literally, there were billboards on the county line in Allegheny County. And the billboard would say, move your business to Westmoreland County for lower taxes. And then you would go to Washington County line and they'd have their billboard. And then you go up to Beaver County line. They were all just poaching each other while the whole pie got smaller. They were all just fighting for whatever little crumb they could manage to hold on to while the whole regional economy declined. And what the folks at Carnegie Mellon said, similar to probably what they've told you through your own Remaking Cities process, is you got to get your act together. You need a shared vision. You got to be able to think about your assets and what you can bring to the table, and you got to build a plan, and then you got to work together to make it happen. And so what they did in Pittsburgh, they formed something called the Working Together Consortium. And that involved hundreds of civic leaders who worked together on task forces and committees and developed action plans, which they then began to implement. Everything from tourism to workforce development to economic development to more unified economic development strategies and marketing strategies for the region. A whole host of activities that they worked on together for the better part of 10 years. So when I started out and I said, you all are moving at lightning speed in Pittsburgh, it took the better part of a decade just to get organized. Now, it's a bigger place. The advantage you all have is you're somewhat smaller. You can probably move faster. But nonetheless, that was the Working Together Consortium. And then they developed regional structures to glue together the whole 10-county region of southwestern Pennsylvania, the whole Pittsburgh region, from the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance that does shared marketing for economic development, to something called the Southwestern Pennsylvania Growth Alliance, where we would staff all the county commissioners and they would develop a priority list for state investment in all 10 counties. And then they would go to Harrisburg together and they would pitch their projects that they had all prioritized and agreed upon should be all the projects that should be funded in all 10 counties. And during the Ridge administration, they would just go down that list and they would fund them all. All 10 counties would get their projects funded, and some of those counties had never had an RCAP project before in the state of Pennsylvania. So a lot of effort to glue it all together. You can see that we have nice straight lines to the west and to the south, and of course those are the state lines. And even though parts of the panhandle of West Virginia are technically part of the Pittsburgh economy, they chose in those days not to cross state lines because they felt it was just too complicated to try to organize. They chose the 10 counties they thought they could organize, and that's how they moved forward. But we're beginning to think bigger than that today as we think about the model that was used to turn Pittsburgh around. So we have the 10 counties, and at the Allegheny Conference, we provide public policy improvement support, competitive improvement support, as well as economic development marketing services for those 10 counties. But as a result of the effort led by the Benedum Foundation and the SPC and the Allegheny Conference about a decade ago, we also embarked on the Power of 32 Visioning Initiative, which was an effort to find other counties surrounding Pittsburgh that wanted to be part of thinking about the future together. And Cambria County raised its hand and has been part of the Power of 32 visioning process ever since. And there's a host of projects that came out of that effort, whether it's building the trail network throughout the region. We developed a $49 million site development fund. So if you have a developer here that wants to do the infrastructure to prepare a site for development here in the Johnstown area, you can actually come to the Allegheny Conference and might be able to get low interest financing for that developer to put in the roads and the sewers and the water infrastructure that they need so that you can prepare a site for somebody to build on. So there's a lot of activity still underway related to what was called the Power of 32, and that's an effort really across 4 states to try to work more effectively together. And then recently, we've been working and are kind of the lead organization with what's called the Great Lakes Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce Coalition. And that's 12 states and 2 Canadian provinces, and we're all going down to Washington, D.C. together to lobby for things like immigration reform, for better transportation infrastructure, for research investment through most of the great research universities, which pretty much occupy that footprint in the United States. So we're big believers that cooperation across government lines and across party lines and across whatever lines you can think of to draw is the way to create success for everybody here. In fact, that's 40% of if that were a country, that blue splotch, I think that would be the 3rd largest economy in the world, after China, the United States, and then if you carved out the Great Lakes, which we're part of. It's a hugely powerful economic area, and we need to do more to work together. And so that's where the Allegheny Conference's head is at. After 75 years of working on this stuff, it's like, how do we get better? How do we bring more people in? How do we cooperate more effectively? how do we create a brand new future. So what's been the return of all of that over the last 35 years since the turnaround, since the comeback period started? Well, this is for the 10 counties, southwestern Pennsylvania. This shows total employment in the 10 counties from 1970 through the better part of last year. So you can see the steel, this is total employment, this is the available labor force, that was the steel bust, that's the loss of 100,000 people, 100,000 jobs in 3 years. Then you can see the bounce back from that. Gradually, certainly we haven't been setting the world on fire from an economic standpoint, but hey, the trend line's been positive, and there's the Great Recession, and kind of the bounce back from the Great Recession and where we are today. The lesson of this slide, so here's the end of the line, right? Walk back over here. What you will see in the 10 counties, there are 100,000 more people working today than there were at the peak of the steel industry in 1979. That to me is a pretty impressive proof of performance in the strategies that Pittsburgh used over that period. In the city of Pittsburgh, 1/4 of the population is now millennials because they're moving in and they're not moving out anymore. And the median age in the city of Pittsburgh is now under 33. The median age in the city of Pittsburgh is now below the national average. It's gone from being one of the oldest cities in America to now being below average in terms of the median age as all of this has taken hold. Even better than that, if you look at young people with advanced degrees as a percentage of your workforce, Metro Pittsburgh now has the 3rd highest concentration of young people with advanced degrees in its workforce. So the only two that beat us are Washington, D.C. and Boston. We actually have a higher concentration of young people with advanced degrees than the Silicon Valley. Now they have more than we do because we're a lot bigger than we are, right? But as a concentration, it's an impressive statistic. And if you're looking for a leading indicator about where you can go in the future, having lots of young people with advanced degrees is a pretty positive indicator of what can happen next. And I know this is true because this is a study by Cleveland State University. And I figure if somebody in Cleveland says it about Pittsburgh, it's got to be true, right? But it's a great indicator. And today in Pittsburgh, we track it on our website, imaginepittsburgh.com. We've got 20,000 open jobs that employers are having a hard time filling. Our problem has ceased to be how to create enough jobs to put everybody back to work. Our much bigger problem today in Pittsburgh is how to prepare enough people to do the work that has to be done, enough people with the right skills. Workforce development now is our #1 priority, compared to where we were 20 or 30 years ago when it was just get a job, get some jobs, whatever kind of jobs you can get. And of course, Pittsburgh managed even to make Amazon's short list as one of the 20 cities and 20 metros that are still under consideration for Amazon's pretty remarkable investment. So that's been our journey over the last 75 years. You know, what can you learn from what happened in Pittsburgh that you might be able to apply here in Johnstown as you all move forward? Well, #1 is keep an eye on the competition. I think we forgot that in Pittsburgh. I think you probably forgot that in Johnstown when you were depending on one industry to drive your whole economy. And when the underpinnings of that industry started to fall apart, we tried to hold on to what was rather than thinking about what's next for too long. And Johnstown got killed by that, and Pittsburgh got killed by that. So you never stop thinking about the competition and how they're doing better than you are and what you can do to be more like them and more successful as they are. Work together. I think the story of Pittsburgh over the last 35 years, but certainly over the last 75 as well, is a story of collaboration and really being willing to come together to think about the future and find ways to work together and compromise, whatever it takes, to make it happen and to move forward together. Invest in technology and your people. Everybody has to be thinking all the time about the quality of their workforce, about the quality of your own ability to do the work. Are you investing in yourself? Are you upgrading skills? Are you learning? Do the people who work for you have the technology they need to be successful and compete? You just can never stop thinking about that and investing in that. And then finally, don't fight change. The world is going to change over the next 5 to 10 years at a rate that none of us in this room can even begin to conceptualize. Comes back to where I started, right, with the idea economy and artificial intelligence and big data and robots and all the rest of it. And we can cry in our beer and be afraid of that, or we can just understand that that's what the future holds. And how are we going to get ahead of it? How are we going to embrace it? And what I would say about it is you have a great advantage as here in Johnstown, because so much of that invention of the future is happening just about 70 miles to the west. And if you really keep an eye on the innovation coming out of the universities right here at home and paying attention to what's going on, it's going to give you the tools and the knowledge that you need to make the right decisions and to prepare and to position Johnstown to be able to take advantage of it and really enjoy and be prosperous in the future. So to paraphrase David McCullough, I think if he could say this, he probably would. The thing to remember is it won't just happen. It's going to take people with great ideas working together, and that's the only way to make it happen. So congratulations to all of you for being here tonight, and I wish you great luck in transforming Johnstown for the 22nd century.